The billionaire lived a life that many people could only dream of. He had everything: immense wealth, a luxurious mansion, a fleet of expensive cars, and a wife who seemed perfect in every way. But despite all of this, something felt off. It wasn't that his wife didn't care for him. She was loving and supportive, always there for him when he needed her. But deep down, the billionaire couldn't shake the feeling that she was only with him because of his wealth. This feeling started to grow stronger with time. He noticed the way people looked at him, how they admired his money, his success. It wasn't just his wife, who seemed to be captivated by his fortune. Even his friends, colleagues, and people he encountered on a daily basis often seemed more interested in his bank account than in him as a person. He began to question everything. Had his wife fallen in love with him, or was it his wealth that attracted her? The more he thought about it, the more he felt like he was just another part of his wife's luxurious life. She didn't seem to care about him as a person, but rather the comfort and security his fortune brought. It hurt him deeply to think this way. But the doubt continued to linger. Was he just another piece of the grand lifestyle she'd grown so accustomed to? After much contemplation, the billionaire decided he needed to test her love, but not in the way one might think. He didn't want to ask her directly, as that would be too obvious and might lead to her feeling hurt or betrayed. Instead, he came up with a plan that he believed would show him the truth once and for all. He decided to fake a life-changing accident, one that would make him seem paralyzed from the waist down. He believed this would be the ultimate test of his wife's love. If she truly cared for him, he reasoned, she would care for him regardless of his wealth or his condition. She would stay by his side, putting his needs above all else, including the luxuries of life. But if she was only interested in him for his money, then he would know the truth. It was a dangerous plan, but he was willing to take the risk. He hired a team of professionals to help him set up the whole situation. They would stage an accident that left him unable to walk. The setup had to be convincing. Everything needed to appear real, from the injury to the recovery process. He thought about what would happen once his wife found out. He imagined her shock, her tears, and how she might look at him differently. But in the back of his mind, he wondered, would she still love him? Would she stand by him when life wasn't easy anymore? Would she prove to him that her feelings for him were real? As the day of the staged accident approached, the billionaire grew more and more anxious. He wasn't sure if he was ready for the truth. He worried that the test he had created might break their relationship rather than strengthen it. But he felt desperate to know the truth, desperate to know if his wife's love was genuine or just a product of his fortune. The day of the staged accident arrived, and the billionaire could feel his heart pounding in his chest. It was hard to shake off the unease that had settled in his stomach. He had carefully planned every detail, but now that it was happening, he wondered if he was making a huge mistake. What if the outcome wasn't what he hoped for? What if his wife saw through the deception and was hurt by his actions? With the help of a small team of doctors and experts, the billionaire was ready to execute his plan. They would make everything look like an accident, one that would leave him unable to walk for weeks, maybe even months. He would be dependent on others for everything: moving, eating, bathing. The idea was that his wife would have to care for him, and that would give him the answers he needed. If she stayed by his side, helping him through the difficult times, he would know that her love for him was real. If she pulled away or struggled with the idea of caring for him, he would understand that her love was tied to his wealth and not him as a person. The accident was set to happen during a routine day at his estate. He had planned to take a small walk around the garden when, just at the right moment, he would fall and sustain a serious injury. The impact would seem real, but it was all stage. The doctors had already prepared the necessary medical equipment, ready to treat him once the accident occurred. The billionaire's role was simple: fall, act in pain, and let the professionals take over. As he made his way outside, he couldn't help but wonder what his wife would do. Would she rush to his side, full of concern, or would she hesitate, unsure of how to react? He had been observing her closely for weeks, noticing how she interacted with him and the people around her. While she had always been loving and caring, he couldn't escape the nagging doubt that maybe her love wasn't as deep as he had hoped. His wife had been busy inside the house, making phone calls and preparing for an evening event. She had no idea what was about to happen. The billionaire positioned himself in the garden, taking a few steps and then suddenly falling to the ground. He let out a loud cry of pain as he landed awkwardly, pretending to be unable to move his legs. Immediately, the people around him sprang into action. The doctors rushed to his side, pretending to assess the injury, while others contacted his wife, telling her that there had been an accident. The billionaire could hear her footsteps approaching quickly. He tried to hold his breath, his heart racing with anticipation. When she saw him lying on the ground, her face turned pale. Her eyes widened in shock, and for a moment, she froze. Then, without hesitation, she rushed to him, her voice filled with panic. "What happened? Are you okay?" She knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she checked for signs of injury. Her genuine concern was evident in the way she held him, the way she softly spoke to him, urging him to stay still and not move. At that moment, the billionaire realized that the plan he had set in motion might have been more than he could handle. He had expected to feel a sense of triumph or relief when she showed concern, but instead, he felt an overwhelming wave of guilt. He had been so focused on testing her love that he hadn't considered how this would affect her. As the doctors worked to stabilize him and prepare for his transport to a hospital, his wife never left his side. She stayed close, comforting him with words of reassurance, holding his hand tightly. The billionaire's heart began to sink as he realized that this wasn't just about testing her love anymore. It was about testing his own understanding of what love truly was. With the accident underway and his wife by his side, the billionaire's plan had started to take shape, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was heading toward a truth he might not be ready for. As the days went by, the billionaire's life began to change dramatically. The accident, which he had planned so carefully, had left him confined to a wheelchair. He was unable to walk, needing help with even the simplest tasks. His wife, who had rushed to his side after the fall, had not left him since. She was there for every doctor's visit, every therapy session, and every meal. Her dedication to caring for him was unwavering, and it left the billionaire both relieved and increasingly conflicted. Each morning, she would gently help him out of bed, assisting him with his routine. He could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the tiredness in her movements, but she never complained. She would feed him his meals, brush his hair, and make sure he was as comfortable as possible. At night, she would sit by his side, holding his hand and speaking to him softly. The billionaire could feel the love in her touch, the care in her voice, but something inside him still felt unsettled. He had set out to test her loyalty, but now he found himself questioning his own intentions. What was he really trying to prove? His wife's actions spoke volumes. She had been more than willing to put aside her own needs to care for him, even when it seemed like it was too much for her to handle. She never showed any sign of frustration, not in front of him anyway, and always wore a smile that masked the exhaustion behind her eyes. But as the days turned into weeks, the billionaire couldn't help but notice how the strain of caring for him was affecting her. She had started to withdraw a little, spending more time on her own when she thought he wasn't watching. He saw her silently cry while she was in the bathroom, away from his prying eyes. He could tell that she was struggling with the pressure, yet she never once complained. The billionaire began to notice the small things, the way she rubbed her temples after long hours of helping him with his daily needs, the sighs she let out when she thought he wasn't paying attention, and the little moments when she seemed distant, lost in her own thoughts. He had expected her to crack, to become resentful of the burden he had placed on her, but instead, she only seemed to grow more tired, more worn down. Her exhaustion was undeniable, and it tugged at his conscience. He had wanted to test her love, but now he was beginning to see the true cost of his actions. He had hoped for a clear answer, something that would tell him once and for all whether his wife's love was genuine. But what he was seeing was far more complex. What had begun as a simple test of loyalty now felt like a cruel game, one that was pushing his wife to her limits. And with every passing day, the billionaire could feel the weight of the guilt growing heavier in his chest. The love she was showing him wasn't just about the physical care. It was about the emotional strength she was showing, the sacrifice she was making without any expectation of reward. He began to realize that love was far deeper than he had ever understood. But at the same time, the billionaire couldn't shake the lingering question. Was her love truly unconditional? Was it for him as a person, or was it tied to the life they shared, the wealth he provided, and the comfort of their luxurious life? He had no answers yet, and the uncertainty was eating away at him, even as his wife continued to give everything she had to him. Her unspoken sacrifices were more than he had bargained for. As the weeks wore on, the billionaire couldn't ignore the growing tension within him. The guilt he had been feeling after faking the accident was becoming harder to manage. His wife, despite her exhaustion, continued to care for him with all the love and tenderness one could imagine. But the billionaire's mind was no longer just questioning her actions, he was questioning his own. His wife had been selfless in her devotion, caring for him as if he were truly helpless. She never once seemed to hesitate when it came to helping him, and despite the strain on her, she would never complain. In fact, the more she took on, the more isolated he began to feel. While she was giving all of herself to him, he realized just how little he had given to her in return. There had been times when he'd felt embarrassed by her kindness, unsure how to respond, and he started to see just how much he had taken her presence for granted before the accident. One evening, after a particularly difficult day of therapy and exercises, his wife left the room for a while to take a phone call. The billionaire sat in his chair, looking out the window. He could see her pacing outside, speaking quietly with someone on the phone. There was a hint of frustration in her posture, and the billionaire couldn't help but feel the weight of that moment. He had always believed that she was the one with the strength and the resolve. But in that moment, he realized how much she had been struggling. He knew she hadn't been sleeping well. The weight of caregiving was wearing her down, and it was clear that her sense of responsibility was turning into a burden. The billionaire wondered whether this was the breaking point. Was she starting to doubt her decision to stay with him? Had the strain of caring for him without a word of thanks been too much? And yet, despite her obvious fatigue, she continued to press on. Later that evening, when she returned to his side, her tired eyes softened as she helped him settle into bed. The billionaire noticed how she moved a little slower than usual, and her voice lacked the usual warmth. But she didn't let it show. She smiled at him, reassured him that everything was fine, and tucked him in. He could see through the smile, though. She was exhausted. She was trying to hold it together, but there was no hiding the weariness in her. When she kissed his forehead goodnight, he noticed something different in the way she held herself. She wasn't just the loving wife anymore. She was a person trying to navigate a life that had become more difficult than she ever could have imagined. She had spent so much of her time caring for him that she had forgotten to care for herself. She had become so focused on being there for him that she had neglected her own needs. That night, as the billionaire lay in bed staring at the ceiling, a new wave of guilt washed over him. He realized just how little he understood what love truly was. It wasn't about grand gestures or romantic words. It was about the everyday acts of kindness, sacrifice, and the willingness to stand by someone, no matter how difficult things got. His wife was proving that to him day after day, even as the weight of it all started to take its toll. The billionaire couldn't help but wonder how much longer she could keep going like this. Could she continue to carry the weight of both their worlds? And more importantly, could he continue to watch her give everything she had without doing more to help her, to show her how much he appreciated her? The questions swirled in his mind, but the answers felt far out of reach. And so, as another day ended, the billionaire found himself more conflicted than ever before. He had hoped to test for love, but now He was beginning to understand just how complicated love truly was. One morning, as the billionaire was being helped into his wheelchair, something unexpected happened. His wife, who had been so dedicated to caring for him, suddenly froze. She was carefully adjusting his blanket, but her hands began to tremble. The billionaire watched her closely, sensing that something was different. He had seen her tired before, but this was different. There was an unmistakable change in her expression. His wife hadn't said anything for a moment, but it was clear that something was bothering her. She stood still for a moment, almost as if she was gathering her thoughts. Then, without warning, she turned and walked out of the room, not looking back. It was unusual for her to leave him in the middle of their morning routine, and he couldn't help but feel a knot form in his stomach. As she disappeared down the hallway, the billionaire tried to shake off the feeling of unease. He had spent weeks carefully observing her, waiting for some sign that would tell him whether her love for him was genuine. But now, he wasn't sure if he was reading too much into things. Maybe it was just a bad day for her, one of those rare moments where the weight of everything finally caught up to her. He sat in the chair for a while, waiting, wondering what was going through her mind. His thoughts drifted back to the original reason for this entire plan, his doubts about her love. He had wanted a clear answer, but everything had become more complicated than he had imagined. His feelings for her were growing stronger, and yet he still couldn't shake the nagging doubt about whether her devotion was rooted in something real or just the result of his wealth and status. Minutes later, his wife returned, but this time there was a subtle change in her demeanor. She was trying to hide it, but the billionaire could tell that she was different. She didn't speak as much, didn't offer the usual comforting words that had become a part of their routine. Instead, she went about her usual tasks in a quiet, almost robotic way. There was a shift in her energy, and it felt like the space between them had grown wider, even though they were in the same room. The billionaire tried to brush off his concerns, but he couldn't ignore the way his wife had reacted. It was almost as if she had seen something she couldn't unsee, something that had shaken her to her core. His mind raced with possibilities. Could she have figured out what he was doing? Could she have realized that he was faking his paralysis to test her? Was this the moment when everything he had worked so hard to orchestrate would come crashing down? That evening, as they sat down to dinner, the silence between them felt heavier than usual. His wife barely touched her food, her mind clearly elsewhere. The billionaire watched her closely, waiting for her to say something, anything, but she remained quiet. He wondered if she had started to suspect the truth. Had she begun to notice small inconsistencies in his behavior, the way he didn't seem as weak or as helpless as he had been in the beginning? Or maybe, after weeks of caring for him, she had simply reached a breaking point. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, his wife spoke softly, almost as if she had been holding her words in for a long time. "I know what you're doing," she said, her voice quiet but steady. The billionaire's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. He had never imagined that the truth would come out like this, so simply, so calmly. She looked at him then, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and something else he couldn't quite understand. "I know you've been faking it," she continued, her voice cracking slightly. "I know that you've been testing me. And I don't know how to feel about that." The billionaire's mind went blank. The truth had come out, but not in the way he had expected. He had thought that his wife would be angry, that she would yell at him or accuse him of cruelty. But instead, she was speaking with a quiet understanding, as if she had already processed everything in her own way. "I don't know why you did it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I do know this. No matter how hard it's been, I never once thought about leaving you. I've been here for you because I love you, not because of what you have or what you can give me. I've been here because I want to be here." The billionaire sat there, frozen as her words sank in. He had expected a confrontation, a moment of anger, but what he got instead was something much more powerful, a quiet truth that left him speechless. In that moment, the billionaire realized that he had been testing the wrong thing all along. It wasn't her love that needed testing. It was his own understanding of what true love really meant. The billionaire sat in stunned silence, processing the weight of his wife's words. He had expected anger, frustration, or maybe even betrayal, but instead, she had spoken with a calmness and strength that took him completely by surprise. Her words cut through the layers of doubt and insecurity he had built up over time, and for the first time in weeks, he felt a deep sense of guilt welling up inside him. He had spent so much time doubting her love, so much energy planning his test, convinced that his wealth had overshadowed everything else in their relationship. But now, hearing her speak so openly and honestly, he realized just how misguided he had been. She hadn't been with him for his money or his status. She had been with him because of who he was. She loved him, truly and deeply, and her actions had shown that, day in and day out. His mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, but the one that stood out above all was how wrong he had been. He had set up this entire scheme to test her, believing that love could be measured by the way someone responded to a crisis. But now, he saw that love was not something to be tested or proven. It was something that grew, something that was built through trust, understanding, and mutual respect. He had failed to see that, and in the process, he had hurt the very person who had always been there for him. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice filled with regret. His wife looked at him, her expression soft but firm. She didn't say anything at first, but the way she looked at him spoke volumes. She had always been the strong one in their relationship, the one who kept everything together. And yet, now it was his turn to be vulnerable. She sat beside him, her hand gently resting on his. "I know you didn't mean to hurt me," she said quietly. "I know you've been struggling with doubts, with fears, but testing me like this, it wasn't necessary. I've been here because I love you, and nothing about that will change." The billionaire's heart ached as he listened to her words. He had put her through so much without even realizing it. The emotional toll of caring for him had been immense, and while she had never once complained, the stress had clearly been weighing on her. But she had carried it all with grace, never showing him how much it hurt. It made him feel even worse. How had he not seen it before? "I've been selfish," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been so wrapped up in my own insecurities that I couldn't see how much you were giving. You've given everything to me, and I've only taken." His wife gave him a small, sad smile, squeezing his hand. "You've always been there for me in your own way. But love isn't about grand gestures or tests. It's about being there for each other, no matter what. And I've always been here for you." There was a long pause as the billionaire sat there, overwhelmed with emotion. For so long, he had thought that love had to be proven, tested. He had thought that if someone truly cared, they would have to endure something difficult to show their loyalty. But now he understood. Love wasn't something that needed to be earned or proven. It was something that flourished when two people truly cared for each other, even in the most difficult of circumstances. The weight of his actions began to settle in. He had hurt her, tested her in a way that was unfair and unnecessary. But as the moments passed, he realized that it wasn't too late to make things right. He could show her the love and appreciation she had always deserved, not by testing her, but by being there for her in the same way she had always been there for him. "I'll do whatever it takes to make things right," he said, his voice steady now, a new resolve forming within him. "I want to be the man you deserve. I want to be someone who shows you how much I love you every single day." His wife's eyes softened as she looked at him. "You don't have to prove anything to me. Just be yourself, and we'll be okay. We'll figure this out together." The billionaire's heart swelled with relief as he realized the truth of her words. She wasn't asking for grand gestures or promises. She just wanted him to be real, to show up for her, to be there in the way that mattered most. And in that moment, he understood. Love wasn't about testing someone's loyalty. It was about trust, respect, and the willingness to stand by each other, no matter what. With a deep sigh, the billionaire leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of his guilt lift slightly. He had learned a painful but invaluable lesson. The real test of love wasn't about making someone prove their loyalty. It was about trusting that love was enough, and that both people were willing to be vulnerable, to grow together, and to support each other through life's challenges. From that moment on, he knew that things between him and his wife would never be the same. They had both learned something important about love, about trust, and the days following their conversation were filled with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. The billionaire couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed between him and his wife, but not in the way he had imagined. The weight of his guilt still lingered, but he was determined to make things right. He knew that simply apologizing wasn't enough. He had to show her that he had learned from his mistakes, that he understood the true meaning of love and trust. His wife, as always, continued to be there for him. But now, there was a new quietness in her. It wasn't the kind of distance that came from anger or resentment, but a gentle sadness that spoke volumes. She had given him everything, and while she hadn't asked for anything in return, he could see that she needed more than just words. She needed action. She needed to see that his feelings for her were as deep as hers for him. One evening, after a long day of therapy, the billionaire sat in his room alone, his mind racing. He had made promises to himself and to his wife, but he didn't know how to keep them. How could he possibly repay her for the trust she had shown him? How could he show her that he truly understood the depth of her love and sacrifice? As he sat there lost in thought, his wife came in quietly, as she always did. She had been handling everything with such grace, but he could see the strain behind her smile. She had kept up with her responsibilities, taking care of him, managing their home, and handling everything in between. But he could tell that it was taking a toll on her. She was tired, not just physically, but emotionally as well. Without saying anything, she sat down next to him. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy with unspoken words. The billionaire wanted to tell her how sorry he was, how much he appreciated everything she had done for him. But the words didn't seem enough. They had said everything that needed to be said earlier, but now it was time for him to show her, to prove that he was willing to be the partner she deserved. "I know I've put you through a lot," he began quietly, his voice trembling slightly. "And I know that I can never take back what I did, but I want to try. I want to be here for you, the way you've always been here for me." His wife looked at him, her tired eyes meeting his. There was a softness in her gaze, a quiet understanding that he hadn't expected. "You don't need to prove anything to me," she said, her voice steady. "I just need you to be here, to be present, to be with me." The billionaire's heart clenched at her words. She wasn't asking for grand gestures or anything extravagant. She just wanted him. She wanted him to be real, to show up for her in the everyday moments. And he realized, finally, that love wasn't about the big, dramatic moments. It was about the small, quiet acts of kindness, the everyday things that showed you cared. He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm here," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm ready to do whatever it takes to make things right between us." She smiled softly, but there was still a trace of sadness in her eyes. "I know you are," she said. "But don't forget, we're in this together. You don't have to do it all on your own." The billionaire felt a sense of relief wash over him. He had spent so much time thinking that he needed to fix everything, that he had to make it up to her in some grand way. But she wasn't asking for that. She just wanted him to be there, to be present, to share in the highs and lows of life together. And that, he realized, was the greatest gift he could give her. The next few days were filled with small changes. The billionaire began to take more of the load off his wife's shoulders, not because he felt obligated, but because he wanted to. He started to take care of things that she had been managing on her own, from organizing their home to handling the daily tasks that had once seemed so insignificant. Slowly, the tension between them began to ease. His wife started to smile more, and he could feel the distance that had grown between them slowly begin to close. But the true transformation happened in the quiet moments, the ones when they sat together, when they shared a meal, or simply when they enjoyed each other's company. It was in these moments that the billionaire realized what he had been missing all along. Love wasn't about the big tests or proving anything. It was about showing up, day after day, and being there for each other, no matter what. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset together, the billionaire finally felt like he had found the peace he had been searching for. His wife rested her head on his shoulder, and for the first time in a long time, he felt truly content. He had learned that love was not something that could be tested or measured. It was something that grew naturally, with patience, trust, and understanding. As the weeks passed, the billionaire's relationship with his wife began to transform in ways he hadn't anticipated. What started as a test had turned into something far more profound. The guilt that had once weighed him down now felt like a distant memory, replaced by a deeper sense of gratitude and understanding. He had learned that love wasn't something you could manipulate or control. It was something you nurtured and gave freely. And now he was ready to do just that. Every day, he made a conscious effort to be present. He took on more responsibilities at home, tried to ease his wife's burden, and found new ways to show her how much she meant to him. It wasn't always easy. Old habits die hard, and he had to remind himself not to fall back into his old patterns of taking her love for granted. But with each passing day, he felt more connected to her, more appreciative of the quiet strength she had always shown. His wife, too, seemed to blossom. The strain that had once clouded her face slowly faded away. She wasn't as tired or overwhelmed as she had been, and the small smiles and moments of laughter returned. The billionaire could see the change in her. Her spirit had been revitalized, and he realized just how much of that was due to the way he had started to show up for her. There were moments of pure joy between them now, quiet evenings spent talking, shared walks around their estate, simple moments that reminded them both of why they had fallen in love in the first place. They had both learned valuable lessons. For the billionaire, it was that love could never be measured by tests or grand gestures, but by the daily acts of kindness, patience, and understanding. For his wife, it was that her love had never been in question, even when she hadn't asked for anything in return. One evening, after a particularly peaceful dinner, the billionaire took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything that had changed. He looked at his wife, who was sitting across from him, a content smile on her face. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace settle in his chest. "I want to thank you," he said, his voice soft but steady, "for everything. For sticking by me, even when I didn't deserve it. For loving me when I was too blind to see it." His wife looked at him with a mixture of tenderness and something deeper, perhaps relief, perhaps love, but something more than either of them had realized was possible. "You don't have to thank me," she replied, her voice gentle. "I love you because you are you. That's all I've ever needed." And in that moment, the billionaire understood. All the tests, all the doubts he had carried with him, none of that had mattered. What mattered was the love they had for each other, the way they had built a life together, not by measuring each other's worth, but by simply being present, by trusting each other. As the night drew to a close, the billionaire took his wife's hand, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars. They had come through something difficult, something that had forced them both to look deeply at themselves and at each other. But now, they were stronger for it. The love they shared was no longer something to be tested. It was something to be cherished, nurtured, and allowed to grow naturally. The billionaire realized that true love wasn't a one-time revelation or something that could be tested. It was an ongoing process of care, respect, and mutual support. He had learned to appreciate his wife in ways he hadn't before, and he promised himself that he would never take her for granted again. As they sat there, side by side, he knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter for both of them. They had grown together, healed together, and now they would continue to walk through life hand in hand, knowing that no test, no doubt, could ever shake the bond they shared.